finally happened. Here we are at our final lesson from Unit 5. Take a moment and just enjoy it. We're going to talk about how we produce meat. So, what is meat production? Well, it's raising animals for meat as well as other products that we eat. Here are some example. We raise cattle for beef as well as for milk products. We raise chickens for meat as well as eggs. These are less commonly eaten in the United States, but goats like cabrito and sheep are raised for not only meat but also milk. You may not drink goat milk or sheep milk, but you may. I'm weird. I like goat cheese. I think you can make sheep cheese as well. And pigs are primarily raised for meat. There are two major methods we're going to look at: concentrated animal feeding operations, aka CAFOs, also known as feedlots. And I'm just going to call them CAFOs for the rest of the lesson because I'm too lazy to say that whole phrase. Then there's also free range grazing. So we're going to look at each of these methods. We're going to look at benefits and drawbacks and, you know, general information. So let's talk about meat production in general. So this diagram is showing you how many square meters of land you have to produce 100 grams of protein in each of these forms. So for example, to produce 100 grams of milk protein, you need 27 square meters. To produce 100 grams of fish protein, you need 4 square meters. For root vegetables, you need 3 square meters. Notice when you start having some of these other things, poultry, for example, is 7 square meters, pigs are 11. But when you get to larger animals like lambs and beef, notice you need like 164 meters squared, many, many times the amount of space that you need for a lot of these other sources of protein just to produce that 100 grams of protein. It takes anywhere from 10 to 20 times more land to produce the same amount of calories or the same amount of protein from meat as you get from plants. This has encouraged people to think of things like Meatless Monday or development of plant-based meat alternatives like Impossible or um, Beyond brands, because that will help reduce our use of agricultural land. Right now, most of the land we use, especially in the United States, isn't used to feed people, it's used to feed animals. So if we reduced meat consumption, we could, for example, use less land for agriculture and let that land, go back to a more natural ecosystem with higher biodiversity. So let's look at a CAFO. These are some pictures of CAFOs. One that is just lots of chickens in a chicken house, and another that is a lot of cattle. So these operations are used to really quickly raise livestock, get them fattened up as quick as possible, so that way you can slaughter them. The animals tend to be in very crowded conditions, and a lot of times these animals aren't eating the foods that they would naturally eat. For example, cows eat what? Well, if you answered grass, you were correct. But guess what cows are fed a lot in CAFOs? They're fed corn, which has its own impacts. They generate a lot of waste. Basically, it's a ton of poop. You've got a lot of animals in a small space, they make a lot of poo. And then when it rains, water runs off, picks up whatever nutrients have been, decaying in that giant pile of poop, and it can lead to surface water, and that can cause eutrophication. But it has a benefit in that it's a lot less expensive than the other method, which means it's going to be cheaper for people to buy. A subset of a CAFO is dairy farming. You have female cows, they birth calves, and then for a short period of time after that, they'll produce milk. And then on all modern kind of dairy institutions, we use these milking machines to milk cows, gather their milk, and then it has to be refrigerated and processed before you can sell it. Now, some dairy farms don't do their own processing, but they still need to refrigerate it before you can get it to a store. Otherwise, it'll go bad too quickly and they won't be able to sell it. They're raised in these environments that are kind of similar to CAFOs in that there's, a lot of crowding, and so they have a lot of the same environmental impacts. So free range grazing, the United States allows you to call your meat that you've produced free range if the animals are allowed to be outdoors more than half of their life cycle. So it doesn't mean that they're constantly outdoors, but they are at least, they're not penned up in a building the whole time. What are the advantages? Well, their diet can more closely resemble a natural diet. So cows can eat grass, chickens can kind of peck around for vegetable matter or worms. Um, a lot of these free range operations, they're trying to go more organic so they can, raise more money and be able to support themselves. Because what we're going to see is free range grazing causes the meat to be more expensive. So if they're trying to get an organic label as well, they can not feed their animals antibiotics or use a lot of other chemicals, which can decrease the environmental impacts of those. And since they're not in a super high concentration, their poop lays where it falls, decomposes with the natural decomposers in the area, and fertilizes the grass or whatever else you're growing in that area. What are the disadvantages? Well, you need more land. So it's going to use more land than a CAFO, and it's also more expensive for consumers. So if you vote with your dollar, if you can't afford to buy free range meat, then you're going to have to buy what's on a CAFO because that's what you can afford. So what are some of the environmental impacts of meat production? Well, if you take a cow and you feed it a bunch of corn, that doesn't agree with its digestive system. If you've ever known somebody who's lactose intolerant who eats dairy products, oh, they get gassy. Same thing happens to cows when you feed them on a large diet, a diet that's mostly corn. And so you may have heard of cows burping methane or farting methane. The methane that they release is a greenhouse gas, and you may think, oh, I burp, that's methane. But the thing is, we're not raising like thousands of you in a tiny space. So the impact of all these millions of cows all burping methane because they're not eating grass can be a significant source of greenhouse gases. Then also their waste products can be decomposed by the normal decomposers in the area to make carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrogen oxide, which is also going to add to the greenhouse effect. And then a lot of animals, especially in CAFOs, are fed antibiotics or growth hormones, and that can lead to antibiotic resistance, and that can also cause contamination of soil and the waterways in the area. And then the crowded living conditions allow diseases to spread very easily. By the way, when you see nutrient rich stuff contaminating waterways, you should always think eutrophication. And if you don't know what eutrophication is, it was covered in the impacts of agriculture notes, so go look those up. So, a couple of other environmental impacts. So, if you remember from Unit 2, I believe, we have the 90-10 rule. 90% of the energy that's taken in by an organism is lost as low quality energy in the form of heat and is not available to the next trophic level. Only 10% gets passed on to the next organism. We'll say trophic level. So when you're eating meat, hopefully an herbivore. If you eat an herbivore, you're only getting 10% of the energy that it got from the plants. That's why you need so much more land to raise, to produce the same amount of food, the same mass of food for meat versus plants. If you are eating something that's carnivorous, so for example, tuna is a carnivorous fish, it's getting between 1 and 0.1% of the energy that the producers had. So um, it takes a lot of vegetable matter or plant matter to support these animals. Another thing is that if you look at how much water it takes to support cattle in order to make 1 pound of food, that's about 1,800 gallons of water because you're not just giving water to the cattle, you're also watering the plants that are being grown to feed the cattle. So the normal impacts of agriculture are going to be multiplied by a lot when you look at meat production because you have not only the impact of the animals, the impact of the agriculture you do to raise the food for the animals. That includes the pesticides and fertilizers that were used to protect those crops that were used to feed the animals. That includes the water you use for irrigation, and that also includes any poor agricultural techniques that you use that are not conserving soil. So all of those are consequences of raising livestock for food. Now, I'm not telling you to go vegan. I am not vegan myself. I'm just pointing out the environmental impacts. So, what are some of the other environmental impacts? There's overgrazing. If you have too many animals eating on a specific area of land and the plants don't recover, then that can kill the plants. So if you take grass and you cut it down to the root, if you cut far enough, you will kill the grass to the point where it cannot regenerate. If you leave animals in a small patch of land long term and it's not a large enough space for them, they can eat the grass to death or eat plants to death. What happens then is you have a loss of vegetation, then you have soil erosion, and soil erosion can lead to what's called desertification. Desertification is where you have areas that are arid, meaning they are low precipitation areas, and their aridity is going to increase until the point where they become deserts. So here's how that happens. This is kind of the process of desertification. You have overgrazing, depleting the plants, then rain erodes away the soil, and wind and dry heat blow away the topsoil. That means you retain less moisture in the area. That means you're going to have an increase in runoff. And so less water is going to be in the area, which means you're going to have less water in the air to produce precipitation, and that can lead to desertification. So, for example, this was, I believe, data from 1998. I tried to look for something more recent, but it was kind of hard to find. This image is showing areas that are vulnerable to desertification. So, if you'll notice, like the area south of the Sahara, very vulnerable to desertification. Why? Because it's already a dry area. Areas of Australia, the interior of Australia is pretty much desert. So these kind of areas near the coast would be drier areas that if you do intensive agriculture or intensive raising of livestock there, it could theoretically cause that land to become less productive and have desertification happen. Here in the Middle East area, that's also an issue, as well as in the Western United States. You know, you have several deserts in this area, and the areas that are not deserts are going to be more dry or arid biomes. And so, if you have intensive livestock raising there and you have overgrazing happen, that can lead to the possibility of desertification. So, there is me as Bacon bidding you farewell. And next set of notes that come up will be Unit 7.